Great to see all of you here. What an amazing crowd. Welcome to the Falling Walls Roundtable on the future of open science. My name is Alina. I'm a science journalist, which is one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be here with you today and talk about this topic. I'm working with Der Spiegel, but it's not about me. It's about these guys here, my distinguished guests. There's 4 of them. The first one is Julieta Arancio. She's a social science researcher and part of the open research community Accelerator, short ORCA.
That's right.
Then we've got Magdalena, editor-in-chief of Nature and chief editorial advisor for the Nature portfolio. So glad you're here. Then we've got Broz, who has responsibility for leading IBM Quantum's business development. And last but not least, Gerard, Meijer, who is a physicist and vice speaker of the DEAL project as well. He also used to be a member of the Wissenschaftsrat. So open access is one of your topics you are really into, let's say that. Otherwise, you would have probably not dealt with it for such a long time. So for the next 30 minutes, we are going to talk about the current state, the chances, as well as the hurdles of open access and open science. And then, dear audience, it's time for you to ask questions. We've got probably 10 minutes for that. That said, I'm nearly ready to dive into the discussion. There's just one more thing we have to do, and that's get on the same page, because we're talking about open access as well as open science. And from my understanding, open access is a part of the broader open science movement. And while open access focuses on accessibility of the end product, for example, the publication, open science obviously also includes accessibility, but is also concerned with the transparency and the reproducibility of the entire research process. Are we all good with that definition?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, then let's dive in. And Magdalena, I would like to start with you. As you say about yourself, you've got a keen interest in promoting open science practices. There's got to be a reason for that. So would you please share a success story where open access or open science has significantly accelerated scientific discovery or innovation?
So let me start by really re-emphasizing your definition. It's really important that when we talk about open science, we really understand what it is. There are, of course, many different elements to science. When I think about the research process, I really think about individual steps, and I see it as a circle or some kind of a continuous iteration on its process. And that, of course, includes thinking, ideation, discovery, or design, depending on what aspect of research one talks about. And a part of that research process is sharing of that information at each step. And then, of course, that sharing also includes publications. So the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because I think it's incredibly important to think that to realize that there is so much more to open science than just open access. Open access is a key part of it. But if you like, if I was to subvert the term open access, you could use it to mean open access to data, open access to code, open access to ideas, to opportunities, etc., etc. Whereas today we really use open access to mean open access to publications, equally important. The other thing I would say, as an addition to this, I think the reason why it's so important to think about open science in that broadest sense is because if we think about sort of financially supporting science and thinking about return on investment, we're not going to realize return on investment, wherever that investment comes from, if we just, as I sometimes flippantly put it, liberate words. We really need to liberate all research objects. Scientists, researchers, innovators build on ideas, but they also build, of course, on the actual results, on the actual objects of research. So all of this is necessary. Now, you asked me about a specific example. I think the best examples that have been around for a long time come from medicine, from clinical practice and biomedicine more broadly, where for example, in the case of rare diseases, by definition, they are rare. There are very few individuals who manifest with a specific disease. So on the one hand, clinicians who are trying to describe those diseases, who are trying to identify treatments that work appropriately or perhaps maybe even have side effects, which of course need to be avoided, are often in desperate need to combine their own observations with those of others. Mm-hmm. That is incredibly difficult if the information is not shared. And an important component to this example, of course, is that is something that is normally not talked about in the context of open science, but in my mind walks in hand with it, and that's really co-creation in research. Mm-hmm. And of course, here I'm talking about patients. So patients are absolutely key for them to have access to information. That information has to be shared, has to be open. So this probably is by now the best established example. Mm-hmm. There are others, for example, in food system space and so on.
Thank you. Definitely we'll come back later to patients' data or data and how it's used and how it's secured. But first, Julieta, I would like to get your perspective on the state we're in right now. And I mean, you are part of the ORCA initiative, and their general aim is to accelerate the transition towards more open, transparent, and collaborative research environments. Mm-hmm. Now, we've just heard it does happen. So why do you think it's necessary to have such an initiative? What's the deal right now with open science?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here, excited. And I'm really happy to hear what you just said about not moving away from open access, but broadening the definition. I think a very important part of what is happening today with open science is that there is a lot of progress on open access. There are still, of course, things to do. But we have also almost 20 years passed since the Berlin Declaration, and you have the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which is a recommendation based on input from the research community all around the world. And these values that Magdalena was mentioning, these are core values now. So not only open access to publications, to data, mm-hmm. but also research software, research hardware, and a huge component of making research meaningful. How do we involve, patients is one example, but affected communities by research into the design of the research agenda. There is a whole movement towards broadening what we understand for mm-hmm. open science, which I think is key for addressing the challenges we have. But at the same time, we see that there is some alignment, and that's a huge opportunity in terms of values. So associated with this switch or this broadening of the definition, almost every institution these days has an open access at least policy. Mm-hmm. Some of them have an open science policy that aims to be more ambitious. So there are coalitions here in Europe, but also in the US forming that try to coordinate that movement towards making open science the default.
Okay, so that sounds to me as if open science is not just an action or a practice, but more of a philosophy.
It's research culture. It's part of research culture. Yeah.
That makes it even bigger, doesn't it, and even harder. And I mean, Gerard, if we say it's a philosophy and it's part of culture, I mean, you've been involved with the deal negotiations with the 3 major publishers, Wiley, Springer Nature, Elsevier, for a couple of years now, to reach German-wide agreements on open access and publishing scientific articles. How's that going?
Well, I think we made in Germany, we made great progress on that. Also internationally has been made great progress on that. Just to comment on what you started with, open access isn't just a policy choice. It's in a way, it's a financial strategy that for an institution that drives a more transparent and innovative and efficient research ecosystem, right? And so people have to realize that there's more behind it. Indeed, if we talk about open access, we mean open access of scientific publications in this context. So as it was said, and it's the free availability of the research output, right? Whereas open science is broader than that and advocates for openness and transparency for the whole process. But we have to realize that researchers, they can conduct their work with open science principles, but and they are increasingly doing so. We see that preprint servers and so on are used ever more. But if they ultimately publish their final articles behind a subscription paywall, then that defeats the purpose, and it's an inefficient way of research funding. And so one has to realize, I think, that without open access, open science has no chance. Right? So it's really a very essential part. And there good progress has been made. And having said that, we're also maybe at a critical juncture. I mean, so about 50% of the scholarly articles are now published open access. But about 80% of the institutional investment in academic publishing goes into subscription paywalls. That we have to realize. So things still need to be done there to change that. But
Yeah.
so in Germany with the deal contracts with the 3 major publishers, which have 50% of the market, so that's an important part. We just see that there has also been a very good take-up by the institutions in Germany. It's an opt-in contract, so, and we see that 97 or 98% of the institutions decide to participate.
Okay.
And that shows that this policy, this mindset is there to do it, and that's essential if we also want to make progress in open science.
Yeah. Money and funding is definitely a topic we're going to talk about in a short while. I saw your sign. Do you want to add right now, because Joseph hasn't
Just a tiny. I'll just say one thing. Let's remember that there is more to research output than scientific papers, which I think why it's so important to talk about open science. Of course, we need to then talk about components. And it's interesting and important, and I hope there'll be an opportunity to talk about it later, to think how publishers and editors in particular, who have the closest touch and closest connection with the research community, can facilitate open science practice and can support that. And we can talk about this later.
We definitely should.
This notion that we need to holistically think about output of science beyond publications as well.
Thank you. So Joseph, you're with IBM. It's a global company. Let's call it the private sector in this setting here. How do you see the movement from your perspective, from that perspective of a company who's, also working with open code and trying to get the open access, open science out there?
Sure. Thank you, Alina. And also, I'm just thrilled to be here. So I come from IBM, and I'm going to take just a slightly different approach to this, because for us, it's more than a theory, and it's more than a philosophy. It is really a way of doing good business. And let me explain that a little bit. So I'm vice president of IBM Quantum, and what we are doing is moving quantum computing as an emerging technology into the marketplace. Now, we went into the cloud in 2016, and part of our cloud access service was open, was free. And through that, we have been able to enhance and accelerate adoption of this emerging technology so that we could decrease the barrier, lower the barriers to entry. In addition, something we have done is really enhanced education. So, for example, through our coursework that we have for free and open online on YouTube, and some of you may have looked into our programming courses, and I see heads nodding. We have been able to educate 8.2 million people on the globe on quantum computing. And finally, we decided early on that we would make our software open source. So you can get our code as open source. As a result, 8 of our competitors use Qiskit, which is the name of our software. So again, having an element of course, we have a premium paid service, and it's much higher performing and so on. But
you got to make money, right?
But we got to make money.
Yeah.
So it is good business, and we're able to seed the markets. And one of the worst things that a company can do in the emerging science and emerging technology area is to move too quickly. You have to move with the market adiabatically, meaning that you'll move forward, but if you go too fast and move out ahead of that market, you'll provide tools that no one can use. You'll have great computers that no one wants. And what we try to do is stay adiabatically with the market, and part of that is open science and open access. And I'll add one more thing.
But quickly.
It helps our talent pool.
Okay. Yeah. That's also a question, Julieta, because you just stressed the fact that with open access papers, publications, they get more attention. They get, at least I know for Springer Nature, got the numbers here. The articles are accessed 4 times more often than others, and they're cited 1.6 more times on average. So Julieta, would you say open science is also a career booster because it enables young, upcoming scientists access to information of groups worldwide that they normally would not have access to?
Yes, definitely. And there is research on that. In fact, research led by one of my colleagues at ORCA, who's been looking at the visibility of careers of researchers who publish open. I think we also have a very close example in the private sector with open source software, how people use GitHub to showcase their work. It's part of their CV these days. And it's not only as an individual, but it fosters connections in unexpected ways. So I think this is definitely a good point for open science. There's one thing that I would mention, and it's that right now, open science has been fueled for so long by researchers who are doing practice, like not only the philosophy, but embodying the practice every day by using this as part of the work. And now we're moving towards, institutionalization, coalitions. We need to coordinate better, so these people who are doing the work are better supported. We cannot depend on just people doing open science because it's great, yeah, they like it, they're philosophically aligned. But I think there is a need for a push for a coalition to say, okay, it's not one institution changing, for example, incentives in careers, recognizing open science work, but it's just a massive effort towards that direction. And we have some, with Quara or other coalitions who are going into that direction. What we see from organizations like us is that at the landscape level, there are systemic problems that impede that acceleration. So that's the challenge right now, at least for us, that we see at the systemic level. How do we unlock those? So we have the leading examples. How do we move forward and make it default?
Let's get into that a bit more, right? Because I mean, we try to solve some of the problems here, like overcome some of the obstacles, maybe. Because I mean, let's be honest. In this surrounding, the academic field, we've been discussing open science for 2 decades, more than 2 decades. Obviously, as you've just stated, we've made a step forward, or even some steps forward, but we're still not there where you guys, at least, maybe some of you, want to be. And I would like to find out why. Why is that? Because we all agreed it can accelerate research, findings and errors are shared, others can build on this, we're getting information faster in politics and businesses, we can educate people, sounds all great, but it is not the standard procedure. So there seems to be a problem with implementation. And now we come to the money part. In my opinion, when I talked to you beforehand a bit, most of you also stressed the problem of funding, the problem of money. Who's actually paying when for what? And it seems to me like there needs to be a change of payment modalities. I mean, one no longer pays for the right to read, but instead for the right to publish something. And that's not how it's done at the moment. Correct me if I'm wrong. But maybe you do have a best case where someone already changed it, and I would love to hear about that. But I mean, Gerard, for Deal, you've talked to publicists, for example, and you've chaired a working group that has drafted the recommendations to get more open access, being part of the Wissenschaftsrat, and you addressed researchers, scientific institutions, their management, and also research funding organizations. So basically, everybody who is thinking and talking about open science and open access. What's the best case payment model you came up with?
What's the best case payment model? So first of all, what is the problem? I would say also repeating what we heard in the news the last days. It's the economy, stupid, right? I mean, it's really the money is a big obstacle there. It is indeed that we're used to pay for the reading access, right? And now we pay for publication. Actually, the authors never knew what the institutions paid for the reading access, but they do know now because they see this, what needs to be paid for publication. Then they will often say this is a large number, but they don't actually know what number to compare it to. So we have to communicate. We have to tell people better how that is.
Sorry for interrupting, but do you have some numbers maybe?
Oh yes, there are studies being done that in the subscription system, what we actually paid per article at that time, we didn't have to pay it in that way, but if you calculate back how much money was in the system and how many articles, there's a white paper from the Max Planck Society, from the Max Planck Digital Library from 2015 that comes up with 3,800 euros per article. And that is the number you would have to compare with PAR fees or APCs that you're discussing now. So the situation is that so universities were set up to have budget for the library so that reading access for the authors could be paid. And the management of the leadership of academic institutions have to realize that they have to make sure that there is going to be what the Wissenschaftsrat called an information budget available, such that really the publication costs for all their scientists can be paid for. That is really their responsibility, just as it was their responsibility in the past that they paid for, that they made access to reading available. The problem there is that that if you have institutions that publish a lot, for them it might be that the costs go up, right? But overall, I mean, everybody agrees open access is a good idea. We want things to be available. We want others to read it and to cite it. And we want others to build up on it, scrutinize also the results, and so on. So everybody agrees with that. Everybody likes transparency versus non-transparency. So we all agree with that. But then you are in the situation that some institutions, and we also agree that overall it will not cost more than it costs in the subscription system. So we have a goal that we all want to go to, and we know in the end it's going to be cheaper. The problem is on the way there, some will have to pay more than they did in the past, and others will actually get money back, so have to pay less. If those who have to pay less will immediately want to cash in on that, and those who have to pay more refuse to do that, we'll never get there. And that's a little bit the critical situation we're in, and that's the barrier we have to overcome. And again, we're making very good progress there, but we're not there. And basically what institutions have to do, and I can say that easily because this is exactly what the Max Planck Society did. I mean, basically use everything that was in the past paid for subscription fees, exactly that same pot of money is basically used to pay now for the publication cost for all the researchers. But most institutions need to find a way to set that up appropriately.
Okay. Is that something, Magdalena, that you are actually, you're on the editing side. Are you involved at all with this kind of process, or do you just get involved with the end product?
So I'm not directly involved in financial negotiations. I like to describe it as a separation of church and state. As an editor, I focus on the strategy, the direction of the journal, in my case, Nature. But of course, it's something I think about a great deal. I think about it because, and I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record, I'm going to lift us back out from open access to open science, because I think that is really important to keep it in proportion and in perspective. Because, of course, there is a cost to everything. We're discussing here the cost of research. And the cost of research includes cost of publications, cost of generating data, code, also infrastructure, incidentally. And when we talk about open science, we really have to talk about supporting open all of these things that I listed. So one of the things, for example, we don't often talk about is open infrastructure. And yet we want researchers, we expect researchers, all of us, for all the right reasons, talk about open science. Many researchers, and I deliberately say many and not all, and I'll come back to this in a second, want to practice open science, but often they find it really hard because there isn't sufficient open infrastructure. Often, in some cases, in some disciplines, that infrastructure exists, databases are very well curated, they're very well maintained, and there are specific costs that are allocated for that activity. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that my team, for example, editors at Nature and more broadly in Nature Portfolio do is for researchers who submit papers to us, we actually point them in the direction of that infrastructure where they can share the data, where they can share the code. We actually facilitate peer review of code. This is especially useful for researchers who, and that group is of course very numerous, who are not actually software engineers, but now increasingly find themselves needing to use code as part of their research. So I think we have to, you spoke about the budgets being there specifically in the context of publication. I would say we really have to think about what does it mean that we are financially supporting research, and how do we want that research to look? And I think you just said we're all agreeing that it needs to be open, and that there is a cost to that. Now we tend to, and this is my second point that hasn't been mentioned yet, I think. We all, regardless of what walk of life we talk about, we tend to be happy to part with money in exchange for something that we value. And my suggestion would be that we don't value open science enough yet. So, in response to what you were saying, I 100% agree that there is an incredible enthusiasm, especially, to be honest, amongst the younger generation of scientists towards open science. But I have personally heard somebody say to me, an early career researcher say to me, I would love to practice open science. It takes time and effort to do it, which in my view, of course, in her view, is time well spent. But I am continuously told by other colleagues, if you want to progress your career, don't spend your time on this, because that is not what's going to be evaluated.
Okay, so is that the systematics?
Back to incentives, right?
Okay.
So it's a systemic problem where we all have the good intention of doing open science, but then when there is a review, a research assessment process, suddenly we all go back to the old metrics. And I'm going to build up on that just one point very quickly and say that, I think in terms of money, we need a little more imagination. Like when I was talking about coalitions, I'm talking about cross-sector coalitions, including the private sector. There are things that we can, business models that we can think of, and governance models that we can think of, so science stays out of vendor lock-in and in the public. But what Magdalena says, I think it's key. Today, it's not very easy to practice open science. So how do we... I have thousands of examples here in Europe and some in the US. ORCA is a US-based nonprofit, where there is great infrastructure, but it's maintained by a group of researchers in a university on a grant funding model. So the grant is running out in 2 years. No one is going to maintain it anymore. That infrastructure disappears, right? Because no one keeps it going.
So you're saying we would even need a completely different funding structure?
Well, not completely different, but we need to talk to other sectors. We need to understand where there are opportunities for collaboration while keeping governance models that keep science in the public and everything open, right? Because this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable to have one repository there that people want to use, except for the classical disciplines like astronomy or physics, that they have their own model and that works. But for the rest, it's not like that.
And you just mentioned the incentives. What exactly is an incentive for you?
Well, there's a whole discussion right now, and open science is part of research assessment reforms. It's not the same as research assessment reforms, but it's a big part of it. And in fact, I would like everyone to look at a report that came from Science Europe recently on the crossing between open science and research assessment reforms. It's really interesting. It's a survey to their funders in Europe. And when we're talking about incentives, is not only making open science or team science work visible, which is great, for example, through the implementation of narrative CVs, which have more qualitative information rather than only quantitative, that's great, but also what counts for tenure in the US or promotion. When you want to become a professor, is it going to be like Magdalena says, you're a postdoc and you're told, don't dedicate yourself to this, or actually the committee is going to say, wow, this is interesting work, we're going to promote you. So I think better transparency in the promotion process would be, I think, a great step forward. But also putting our thoughts and our value of open science really into practice. There is one problem, though, and I think not a problem, more of a challenge that I think we should talk about later. That is, we have this values alignment in open science and all this work that is fantastic in open science and all the challenges. We have not agreed yet, and I mean at the landscape level, on a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework. We have no way today of knowing if the things we're doing are taking us where we are saying they're going to take us. So that's, I think, a big challenge.
Does IBM have such a monitoring process? Do you evaluate, how do you evaluate if that's what you're doing there, the approach you chose is actually, well, valuable for your institution, but also for the rest of the community?
Yeah, well, certainly. And in fact, what we need to talk about is the research and scientific results that aren't immediately published. And that would be what's caught up in intellectual property, okay? So that's a bit of an elephant in the room. It's not immediately published. It's held proprietary, and oftentimes businesses need to, operate off of those patents and the licenses. That's a large part of income. So when I started my career in the United States, there were, it was about 80% of research and development funding was public, and about 20% in the private sector. Today, that is reversed. 80% of the research and development, which constitutes 3.4% of our GDP in the United States, is funded by private institutions, by companies. That's going to naturally lead to patents, intellectual property, and proprietary know-how that won't see the light of day, at least immediately, and maybe never. So I think it's really important that companies look at that balance, and it's certainly one that we look at.
Okay. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something, some remark also on the monitoring, and so that to point out that also there publishers and academia can work very well together. And if we look at the transformative agreements that have been made with the big publishers, it's not only about the price. There are a lot of other things in that authors are requested to deposit data somewhere, use preprint service, and so on. And so in that way, can also support open science activities in that way. I still want to stress, I said that once more, but once before, that open access really is the gateway to open science, right? I mean, so scientists have shown, I think, that they embrace open access right now. But what still needs to be done is the financial restructuring in the institutions needs to be done. And institutions and leadership of academic institutions need to realize that. Too long it has been thought that, I mean, the publication budget is, I mean, the head of the library deals with that. And now we have a different system. Well, it's still the head of the library dealing with that. This is no longer possible. I mean, too many things come together. It is research funding. It is this information budget is more than just the original library budget. And so leadership of academic institutions need to take on their responsibility to restructure some funds. In the end, it's not going to be more expensive, but it comes from different parts, and it needs to be done. And we also see that the recommendations from the Wissenschaftsrat, when they were sent around in Germany, and they end on the desk of the president or director of the university, they give it to the head of the library, which should not be done. I mean, they have to take care of that themselves, and they have to realize that. And as long as that is not done, it's very difficult to change anything.
Magdalena showed some interest in that.
Yes, I just wanted to link and sort of emphasize this idea of research and development done in the private sector. Often, when we talk about open science, we don't talk about or think about research done in the private sector. We think that somehow by definition it cannot be open. And of course, the primary reason for the private sector is not to share information and publish information, but that doesn't mean that cannot be part of what they do. And you explained, of course, at the beginning how so much of your code is open source and so on. And precisely because of that change of proportion of funding, we are seeing more and more of the R&D from the private sector being published and shared. Often that work is published open access, and often the actual research objects are shared using open science principles. I'm just going to mention the Chemistry Nobel Prize of this year, one part of it. That part, so that was the AlphaFold tool, AI-based tool, was developed by DeepMind for protein structure prediction, accelerating protein structure prediction. And DeepMind is, of course, part of Google. And that, actually very beautiful story, was in partnership with a public open protein database. And so here was a real partnership of private and public. So, you know, we have tremendous opportunities, actually, to be really imaginative about how we advance open science, not just in certain disciplines, not just looking at one part of it, not just in academia, but really embracing it right across the research ecosystem.
And also if everybody has access to the research, everybody can filter the information. It has to be done in a way that, again, also this process of basically I'm sorry, I'm lacking the word, but if you read it, and then normally the peer-reviewed process, you know, it's behind locked doors, and then when they come up with the result, that's a good paper, we can publish that. That would be something that would be done more openly, right? So we would also have mistakes out in the open. How do you make sure that this doesn't reflect badly on the researchers that have accomplished what they did in this paper? Because obviously mistakes also help to get forward in science. How do you make sure that the data out there is not misused, you know? Or not even intentionally, but maybe just accidentally, because there's a lack of knowledge from the other discipline. I feel like, I mean, that's all topics we cannot get more into, but there's also hurdles on a much smaller scale than we just discussed here, but that are also, well, in daily life, daily scientific business, really important parts.
Just to strengthen that point, in the US, where the private sector is kind of has a different role also in funding science, we see some of the most progressive policies in open science. They have implemented requirements that are really hard on their grantees, let's say, sometimes, and with incredible results. So I think there is also this chance to engage with maybe smaller funders that have more capability to implement changes faster and do some experiments. Foundations here who also work in that direction. There is, I think it's good to have a call for more cross-sector collaboration and more imagination in that aspect.
So I promised you guys 10 minutes of questions. Now it's approximately 5 to 7. Sorry about that. But who has a question? Oh, wow. Yeah, please, let's go work our work backwards.
Thanks.
Hello, does that work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it does work, yes.
I'm Eric Isaacs from Carnegie Institution in DC. I have a general, single, simple question. What can go wrong? You know, this is a great positive discussion. Actually, you just said, Alina, something about, you know, data getting out there. You know, 20, 30 years ago with the internet, we said it's going to democratize everything. Mm-hmm. Well, do we agree that it's democratized the world? My concern, I mean, we talked a little review. I understand the IBM model, which is sort of creating digital twins to get people trained up, and eventually then you can sell, you know, licensing subscriptions. So I get that, but you're also doing a lot of the internal review yourself. So trusting IBM, which I do, is doing a good job. I really worry about this idea of you mentioned pushing some of the review back onto the universities, for example. It just can't happen. It's not, well, it could happen. It's unaffordable. I mean, universities don't have the bandwidth to do that, so who's going to do it if it's not Nature? So Nature's done a great job with editorial and review processes. I really worry. I'm just asking the question, what could go wrong?
Thank you.
Project 10 years into the future, what could go wrong?
Yeah, please, who wants to take this one?
Can I give just very, very short part answer? And what I'm about to say is something actually that is not talked about very often, and this is something that can go wrong now, today, already. And that is that, you know, it's a concern that is often voiced by researchers in much less well-resourced settings, that they share the data openly, and these data are used by others to analyze and capitalize on. That's something that already goes wrong, and that can be fixed actually by some of the incentives and realizing that, for example, data creators or curators provide as much of an input into research ecosystem as those who publish papers.
What about the early career scientists who no longer own their own data, their own
Early career research, exactly. So there are,
out of science?
yeah. I mean, of course, nothing is black or white, right?
Yeah, there are things that can definitely go wrong, and there's lots of people working on frameworks to try to avoid that. I'm thinking of careful principles, for example. It's not okay to share all data all the time. Indigenous populations, for example, who are participating in research, maybe they don't want their data shared openly. So
medical data.
Medical data, exactly. So there are, I think, things can go wrong, definitely. My perspective, and I think ORCA perspective also, is to have a more empowered research community that can have like greater control on the process of opening.
Thank you, sir. Oh, where? Here. Please.
Hi.
Go for it.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. It's extremely important for all of us. As a young postdoc, I have a question regarding the publishing process. So one of you offered that maybe we don't invest as a society enough in open publishing. And my question is somewhere like the elephant in the room. Why do we need the traditional publishers? Why can't we use other, maybe public publishers that will obviously be cheaper, maybe the peer review will be double blind. All the problems that we keep talking about again and again for years, we hear about it for years, and I think that maybe publishers are part of the problem because they are private, and somehow the society, all of us, the universities, pay for it way too much instead of just replacing it with a new method.
Maybe
Yes.
I've been chairing the Berlin Open Access Conference series for quite a number of years, and this issue often comes up and is often discussed, right? I mean, what alternatives are there, and are there alternatives that are cheaper? And yes, from that community, we strongly support all those different initiatives, and we should do all kind of grassroots initiatives. Fact of the matter is that 50% of the publications are really published by the 3 major publishers. And that was the reason that in Germany, when we started to try to make open access of scientific publications a reality. If you want to do that at any scale, you cannot do it without the publishers. That's just a reality. And that's why we spent a lot of time on that and getting good contracts there. And yes, we still think we pay too much. So we're trying to do our best to change that. But there are other publishers that can do this cheaper. There are different models, but it's all on a very small scale and often not very sustainable.
If I may comment, sorry, but when young scientists try to get a position, practically everyone cares about nature, science, and cell. This is how the world works for the last few hundred years, probably. And I mean something like, let's say 200 years, maybe less. But we can change it, and it's not too hard. So obviously we have this option. Now let's translate into hiring new maybe PIs, and then things will change. And I'd like to hear also, so there is a new format, let's say the format of eLife, which is very unique, let's say. I'd like to hear what you think about it in this term.
Well, we have nature on the stage, so maybe.
just a very quick comment. The comment you made about nature cell science, and they are listed in various orders depending on who's speaking. This is not a problem of the publishers, it's the problem of the evaluation system that uses a proxy to evaluate researchers who publish the research. It's an interesting, it's easy to make that shortcut and say, if only we got rid of those publishers, the system would be solved. I would like to suggest, and actually I'm very much in agreement with what you said, is that I'm a biologist by training, I'm a geneticist. Genetics is very close to evolution. I think about ecosystems, and I think about niches. A healthy ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem. We need a whole variety of publishers. We need a whole variety of journals, eLife, we need preprints, but we also need to value other types of research output. We talked about databases. We talked about, in response to Eric's question, I said about what can go wrong, that data generators can be scooped effectively. Well, they wouldn't be scooped if we really valued generation of that data, or I don't know, calibration of a tool or an instrument, and so on and so on. I think we just need to be more imaginative.
A little comment on that, and I think you mentioned
really a little
really
comment,
short.
because we do have more questions.
So, I mean, you made the right point.
Sorry. sorry. Just give her a chance to do one comment, and then it's your turn. I know thank you for being patient.
I think you mentioned you are a postdoc, early career researcher. I can't see you from here. I was an early career researcher too, a year ago. Because I'm not in academia anymore. But I think if we can focus, it's really hard because of what we were saying. The incentive you're evaluating on publishing and where do you publish, but if we switch, we need to switch this conversation towards the processes. We cannot keep focusing on this. Of course, the publishers' discussion is a huge one. I'm not going to go into that because it's not my domain mostly, but we need to start talking about the process and how do we value that so we can start thinking differently. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in this 20 years for another 20.
For another 20. Sir, thank you.
So I think, this is on. So the only way to break down this wall, as you said, is in the hand of the funding agencies and those who make decisions on careers at university. And what maybe...
Not only, but
they should stop just counting papers, and they should stop adding up impact factors. That's it. They should count what are socio-economical relevant outputs of your research. Have you produced it or not? Where you publish doesn't matter. One of the biggest scandals in Alzheimer research, 2006 paper, was published in Nature. Yeah. So Nature does not guarantee quality of research. Yeah, that's how it is.
No.
So But a young scientist cannot tear down this wall. A young scientist cannot tear down this wall. So NIH, also a funder of research, requested at least after 12 months, every paper produced with public money is published in PubMed. So why are European funding agencies not able to demand the same thing? Just demand it.
I just want to say young researchers have a lot of responsibility for doing a lot for open science. So I just want to say that. But I agree that there is a huge role for the funders and funding agencies. We need everyone.
Okay. Blindly, we're out of time. But since you just mentioned that's the wall we have to break down, and I've got the responsibility, we're going over time now, but just keep it really, really brief. I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm beginning with Julieta. What step do we have to take to break down the wall and make open science the new norm? Just a soundbite.
So the coalitions that we have right now, they need to move from values. We are all aligned on values now, great, to strategies. How implementation? How do we all reform research assessment, including open science? How do we come together to think of a monitoring, not only monitoring, tracking open access, but monitoring, evaluation, learning frameworks, so we know where we're going and if we're getting there. If we don't do it together, we cannot depend on the leading ones. So, yeah.
Thank you. Joseph?
Encourage it, incentivize it, and let the free market adjudicate it.
Thank you. Perfect. Magdalena?
I think devise a financial system to sustainably support it.
So make open access a reality and make sure that the financing for that is also organized at the different academic institutions.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for this discussion. Thank you for your questions and your attention. Have a lovely evening. Thank you. Okay.